So this video today will be quite interesting. We're going to be doing a retrospective of...
I'll be doing this.
No, don't do that. A retrospective of a topic I've been meaning to discuss. I guess I should introduce us. Hi, Adrian from Audio Excellence Canada, Philip and Jerry behind the cameras.
I'm the fat guy in the corner here.
Last week we didn't get a chance to do any videos, just because we've just been swamped. Even with the shutdown, it's been quite busy, and so today we're going to do 3 videos actually.
Three? You said 2.
We'll do 2, and then we'll do a bunch of used equipment that just came in.
Oh, okay.
So this way we'll be good for another week and a half or so. Anyway, this is a topic I've been thinking about for quite a while, and thought maybe today would be a good time to cover it. It's, what's happened to the popularity of electrostatic speakers / planars. And let me just give you a background. Back when I just got into the industry, the most exotic speakers, generally speaking, were the planars, the electrostatics, the planar magnetics, and so on. And today, while they still exist, you hardly hear much about them anymore. It could just be me. I haven't been on the forums much because of how busy I am, and also the magazines. I'll scan through them, but again, when I scan, I don't see a lot of or interest in planars and electrostatic speakers, and I think that's a bit of a shame because of potentially how good they can be. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about that. So let me give you a bit of an idea of what used to be available back in the 80s, 90s, and up to about 2000s or so. In the electrostatic category, of course, you have the quads, Acustats, Dayton Wright, Sound Lab, Jensen, Final, Crown. Crown used to make electrostatics. That's just the ones that I remember off the top of my head. And then in planars, you have Carver, the amazing...
Martin Logan.
Martin Logan. Carver, Apogee, Magnepan, Infinity, Genesis Technologies, Bolanda of B&G, Fostax, JVC, Wisdom, Eminent Technology, King Sound. King Sound, I guess, would be under electrostatic. Meitner, when they made that Melio 1 and I think Melio 2 as well. So that's just a relatively small list of what I just remembered. So, Philip, any thoughts about, first of all, what are your impressions when you go back? Did you, given your long odyssey in audio, did you ever own any electrostatic or planar speakers? We never talked about this, so this will be new to me.
Well, I owned quad 57s, which I loved. I used them with quad 2 amps and had real KT66s in it and real EF86s from, Mullard's. That was a really good amp. I actually made money on that amp, I think. Speakers probably broke even. None of it was really expensive, but at the time, it was all the money I had. And I used it only in an intimate setting because I found out how Peter Walker designed those things to be used. And those speakers are designed to be sort of similar to what the experience is in the front balcony or the front seat of the upper balcony of a music hall. So the performance is kind of far away in kind of like a big soundstage, but not necessarily any imaging, which is a weakness or a caveat of all planar speakers. It doesn't really matter which one.
You're going to get hate comments.
I don't care because people are listening and hearing it wrong. They're again confusing imaging for soundstaging. Soundstaging is a totally different thing. Imaging happens within the soundstage. I'm not wrong in this. This is what happens. So I had quad 57s. I had quad 63s. the frets. And that was a total nightmare because it caused me to spend
do you remember what
full
frets?
range, electrostatic, something.
Doublet.
So that speaker is the only electrostatic that imaged.
How do I remember that? And I can't remember what I did yesterday.
Because you're old.
I am old.
So memory works in two different ways. One is electrochemical. In other words, there's a long-term memory is stored in a series of chemical molecules. And short-term is, well, it's not stored.
It's like hard drive and RAM.
So that's why I can forget something literally 5 seconds ago, but stuff that happened 20 years ago.
Talk about
like,
old. I was teasing my wife. She's a bit older than I am. I said, in a couple more years, you'll be 60 and you'll qualify for senior benefits. She threw a really nasty look at me and she says, you're not that much younger. And we were laughing. And then I thought to myself, my God, what happened? Where did time go that literally within 3-4 years, I'll qualify for senior benefits? I could go on the TTC, which is the transit system, and pay either reduced fees or no fees. I'm not exactly sure what. It's crazy. And I remember my oldest brother, who has passed away since, when he turned his 60s, he was all excited. He and his wife said, now we can go into Mandarin's, which is a very popular Chinese buffet place. And every Tuesday, they get a reduced fee. So he can eat all he wants and pay much less than a typical person does, a typical client does. He was all excited. That's crazy.
Except as you age, your appetite kind of decreases.
Yeah.
So when I go to the Mandarin, which I sometimes do with my family, my sisters and my nephews and my nieces, and so forth. I can't eat like I used to. I'm pretty big, but I still can't eat the same way. I can't eat all at once that much, like I have in the past.
But
so it defeats the purpose.
It's just this sudden realization that, my gosh, this number is actually really approaching. 60.
So you do realize that our perception of time changes over, as we age. Mm-hmm. In other words, Jerry, for him, an hour is forever, and for us, it's like, well, that just happened.
Yeah.
It literally is that our perception changes. The arrow of time, our perspective changes on that, and this is something that physicists can actually tell you is observable in a sense.
Getting back to speakers,
I had Quad 63s, and I had to sell a car to buy those speakers. And then because I ended up buying a pair of Audio Research M100s to drive them, amongst other speakers, I was just going nuts and at that time there was no internet, no real internet, so it was very hard to search these things. You had to find all sorts of magazines, talk to lots of different people, and I was really, really, really set on trying to find a set of Quicksilver KT88 monoblocks because I heard they were the perfect amps to drive them. But I used the M100s for a while. I had Dynaco Mark 6s, which were very rare, but for some reason they accumulated in the Toronto region, so you could actually find a pair pretty easily, and I had access to a couple different ones. I switched those out. I bought Martin Logan Arius, which I really, really loved because they had bass. And then the last electrostatics I owned, and I owned them for about 5 years, a pair of CLSs, original CLSs. There's a big difference between the different CLSs available, and I consider the original CLS to be the best of the lot. It had no protection circuit on it. It made it sound better. So you didn't always send the signal through some sort of network to keep it from frying.
Did you ever own any planars?
So the truth of it is that I never owned any big scale ribbons and or planars because I never got to that point. But the first panel speaker I ever heard, I walked into Straight Gain Electronics one day, way back. I guess this
Peter
would be
Chu.
Yep, early '80s, like maybe '82. And
wow, that was a long time ago.
Long time ago. And there was this beautiful sound. It was like Dire Straits. It was Love Over Gold. That record, with Private Investigations and.
One of my favorites.
One of my favorites. It's an all-time audiophile classic.
Blue cover.
Only superseded by Brother in Arms,
Yes.
because that was the other big hot record back, in the mid 80s. So this is like 82, 83 maybe. I was walking by, and I always wanted to go into that store because I knew they had really good stuff. And I walked in, and it was, this Dire Straits was playing. And I was going, where is that coming from? And it was coming from a pair of Maggies. So that was the first time I heard planars. Now, I knew of Maggies from before because the boyfriend of my sister, Vivian, David, who is like a vice president now at Henry's, which is a camera store in Toronto. He had a pair of Magnepan 1As, which he really bragged about. He drove it with a NAD 3020, and he might still own the speaker. That's how much he loved it. He had that speaker. So I knew about the speaker, but he never invited me over to hear it, even though I was the only other audiophile in that entire school. So yeah, I heard them. I never owned them, and until I started working here 4 years ago, never really had a chance to play around much with them. I do really like them. I do want to own a pair, and I'll leave it at that.
It's interesting. You mentioned straight gain electronics. Way back when I first started being aware that there was a whole niche of audio beyond what Stereo Review and High Fidelity magazines used to talk about, the Boses and Techniques and Yamaha. And I discovered through the Yellow Pages, and for the younger among you, Yellow Pages was a book that was published by Bell, telephone company, where you could get all the merchants would advertise their company in this big, huge book. And so I looked up Stereophonic, which was the section. And so I would go through it and straight in electronics. And he was on Elm Street.
Yes.
Right off Yonge Street, which is this very popular street in Toronto.
It's like a 20-minute walk from University of Toronto campus.
Yeah.
So it was close by.
So one day I sought him out, and I saw this. So I don't remember how old he was back then, but when you're young, everybody's old, right? I would have been about maybe 18 or 19, and he looks to me like maybe in his 30s or 40s. And he had a reputation. Everybody had warned me in other stores. He can be very gruff, very grouchy, and rude. I walk in, and I said to him I was interested in the Apogees because back then he was the importer for Apogees. He looked at me, he says, "You can't afford it." And that was the first conversation I had with him.
Well, you couldn't.
Yes,
Come
I
on.
couldn't.
That was expensive.
I couldn't for sure. But I said, "How do you know I can't?" I was just all upset, when you're 18 or 19. So he says, "Well, you're just 18 and these are a lot of money." And eventually he calmed down and we became quite cordial after that. But the first impression is definitely not great.
Well, look, let's face it. At that time, those speakers cost as much as a small car.
Yeah.
So what does a small car now cost? Like $15,000, $20,000. So that's a lot of money.
I was just taken back. Anyways, my first panel speakers that I bought were a pair of Maggies, and I'm trying to remember if they were the 1Cs or the 2s. I can't remember. Bought them from High End Audio.
Oh, okay.
Yes, from Chris Johnson, actually. Shout out to Chris. Chris is the owner and operator of Parts Connection in Burlington. So back before Chris was working part-time, and he and I were both going to University of Toronto. Eventually, he started Sonic Frontiers, and now he has Parts Connection. Anyway, so he sold me those. But my first pair of my first experience with panel speakers were, in fact, a pair of Martin Logan CLSs, and those were truly magical. So much so that over the years, I must have owned maybe 4 or 5 pairs. Because each time I would buy a pair and hook them up to listen to them, somebody would come and listen to it and then say, "I'll buy them," and I wasn't going to sell them, but when you're a small business, you sell when you have to, and I did. So eventually, I got a pair in from Dennis Yakota. Shout out to Dennis. How are you, Dennis? And I've nailed them to the store since, and haven't hooked them up in a long time. But
No. So here's the other part of that story.
Yeah.
You did hook them up because
Yes.
I made you hook them up.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
And one of my clients walked in and said, "I'll buy these." Now the deal didn't go through, but he really wanted to own them.
Yeah.
And you were asking me, "Well, did you really sell them? Did you?" And I said, "Yes." You know.
And I really don't want to, because it's very hard these days, I think, to find a pair in very good condition. And as Philip says, these are spectacular, and they're available in different versions. And frankly, I'm not all that fussy, whether it's version 1 or the version 2Z, which is, I think, the last version.
Yeah.
I love how transparent, how holographic they can be, especially when you pair them with really good tube amps. And I'm just glad that we own them. And in fact, Martin Logan years later introduced a version. What are
A
they
new
called?
one.
Yeah.
A CLZ.
Yes, that's right,
Or
the CLZ.
Z.
Yeah. Now that's not like one full big panel. It's made up of, I think, 2 panels. You have the base panel, and then you have a separate mids-high panel. And every other Martin Logan speaker since then has been hybrids. So you have a separate woofers, and then you have this electrostatic panel. But I still think that there's just this beautiful purity to the pure electrostatics. And if you've never heard them, you should try and get to listen to them. But what's interesting is this. So besides the Martin Logans, I've also, like you, own multiple pairs of the quad ESLs. We've got, I think, 4 or 5 pairs in the back in the storage there. And then the quad ESLs, I even have 63s, and I even have a pair of 989s. And while the quads overall are perhaps more balanced, they're not as transparent sounding. They don't have quite that sense of see-throughness.
Well,
for
the
me.
57s have padding on the back of
Yeah.
the panel so they're not a true dipole.
I used to take them all off.
Well, that's what the
Yeah,
audiophiles do.
yeah.
But Peter Walker actually intended for that padding to serve a purpose, which is to reduce the back wave or to negate it an overall effect. The 63s, on the other hand, they actually have a delay circuit to mimic a point source. They're the only, in the 989s, I guess all the equivalents since then, they have that delay circuit. It doesn't mimic a point source. It will image, and it will soundstage spectacularly. It's, for some reason, even though the membrane is really thin on the quads, it doesn't sound as fast and as transparent as
it
Martin
doesn't.
Logan's, which is actually a thicker membrane.
Yeah, I don't know if they're thicker or not, but I know that when you listen to a pair of CLSs, it's this incredible sound that everything just hangs between the speakers, and it's scary.
So I had a dinner party one time, and I had all these people over, and I had my CLSs playing, and they couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
They had never seen anything like it. They didn't know where the sound was coming from. They said, "Why do you have those room dividers over there? What are those things?"
There's a perfect picture. I think it was Hi-Fi News, and it was basically one of the Martin Logans, the CLSs, and behind it was a guitar, and it was backlit, so you could see through the speakers, and that sort of is a visual depiction of what the speakers were capable of, playing small quartets, vocals, light jazz, and so on. It's hard to do much better than those speakers. So we can spend a whole day talking about this. I mean, there's so much here, but what do you think happened? Why is it that...
Their size.
Yeah?
I mean, they're giant. I mean, my CLS has dominated the room. Even the Arius was pretty big. I can remember I had someone over, and I was very proud of my Arius speakers, and she, of course, made the comment, why are those huge monstrosities doing it in your
Arius is not
living
that
room?
big.
But she thought they were. So that's always made an impression on me that, no matter how you personally view something, someone else will see it differently. And what you think is small, another person will think is overly large. And So there's this acceptance factor that has to take place with the ones that the loved ones you lived with, and you have to take that into account. And we come across it all the time. I believe for a lot of electrostatics, a lot of panel speakers, even Maggies to this day, when we tell them, well, they need to be positioned a certain way, there's no getting around that. You cannot change that because the back wave of a true dipole will take a certain amount of time to get back to the front, and you want to put it in such a way that there's at least 12 dB drop off, which is 6 feet. This 12 will give you 12 dB, and then also the delay in coming back and merging with the front wave is diminished to a point. It's extended to a point where you cannot hear the smearing. So that's what's going on. It's a physical limitation. All of them do it.
I think we were so lucky that we grew up during the era where we could actually experience all these types of technologies and brands and speakers. So we have some sense of comparison between what those technologies can do and their strengths and weaknesses versus what is preponderant, what's the most popular today, which are dynamic speakers. Mm-hmm. And as good as dynamic speakers can be, in many cases, when you hear a good electrostatic or a good panel, you instantly hear that there are so many levels of improvements that you can get just from getting those panel speakers.
So I remember listening to a pair of SoundLab A1s, mm-hmm. which was the largest electrostatic speaker I had ever experienced. And we had it in a store, the Stephen Berthelot's old store, Ring Audio Classics in the beaches in Toronto, and we had these things in. The crates were so big they couldn't go into the store. We actually left them in the alleyway behind the store. So the speakers are installed, and they sounded great. They were like unbelievably rich and full range. Like there was no real weakness outside of the imaging bit, right? Because it's a curved panel too, just like the Martin Logan. It's giant. And then it got humid one day, and then it was wrong. And so that was the big weakness of the speaker, was depending on the humidity, it could really change. And so for a lot of audiophiles who own them, they wouldn't run it on certain days. And if their room was really big and it got a little bit, humid, it sounded horrible. It really depended on humidity. I suppose if you were in Santa Fe, like where the stereophile guys are, and you're like very high up, like 10,000 feet altitude, and the air is thin and dry, it would be a fantastic speaker.
That's a speaker I never cottoned to. So back when I was working for Angie at American Sound, she had a bunch of them and helped set them up and so on. I just never thought that they were magical. And then one year at the CES, what are those? Ray Kimber had a special room where he had, I think, 5 or 6 of these big SoundLab speakers in the room because he was demonstrating his new recording technique. Ray Kimber had gotten really into recordings. We actually have some of those CDs up in the front for sale, if you remember. Anyway, so and he had all these big, huge panels. When I say big, I'm talking, 6.5 feet tall, at least 4 feet wide or so. So imagine 3 across the front and maybe 3 or so across the back. So blanketing, if you will, the whole room. And while the sound was very good, I still never thought, I don't know, Sound Labs never did that much for me. But that's
what about Acustats?
Oh, that's one thing. So the early Acustats, the 1s, the 1+1s, and so on, were quite nice. But I always found them very dark. And then they eventually came out with the Spectra series, and I didn't like those at all. Sold a bunch of them back when I was working for Angie, but never liked them at all. Acustats were one of those speakers, electrostatic speakers, that never did anything.
They still live.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of people who own them.
Yeah, never did anything for me. Yeah, it's just weird.
One of the first I ever saw that had a powered subwoofer that made it. The whole thing was a system, but still 2 separate pieces. And it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to match dynamic driver in the bass region with the panel, because the two have different speeds, which is something Martin Logan's been working on for a very long time. Now I believe the latest versions are quite good in that integration, but it wasn't for a long time.
Which is a good lead. And how much time do we have? 6 minutes?
Wow, really?
Quick list of pros and cons.
Well, no imaging. For me, even though I don't care that much about imaging, I want to have some. And once I learned that there was no imaging, then that's a problem. I don't like the big head.
You can set it up so that the center image is quite sharp, and again, if the speakers are quite tall, you can get a pretty a lifelike performer. But as far as imaging, where you can get a discernment of front and back layers of depth and so on, you get the depth. I don't know if you get the precise pinpoint.
But if you turn up the volume
Yeah.
to where you like it, sometimes that precise focus turns into a big head in front of you.
It can. You have to play with the setup, and certainly room acoustics will play a huge role in this, because you now have the front wave and the back wave to deal with. But anyway, keep going. What
So
other?
second disadvantage, generally speaking, you need really good big power amplification to drive them, generally speaking.
Okay.
Or maybe if you like tube amps, output transformerless tube amps do well with them too. But those are hard to find. Good ones are hard to find
Yeah.
with enough power.
Yeah. 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 What else? Anything else you can think of?
Placement, obviously, they can only go in certain positions in the room. And so if you have a small room, they're very hard to use. Since if you get closer than 3 feet to the back wall, or what we call the front wall now, for years and years it was the back wall, but the front wall, it gets splashy. It actually loses transparency.
You could argue that if you have a relatively small room, if the speakers cannot be, say, a certain distance, so generally speaking, 4 to 5 feet from the front wall is a good starting point. And if you can't do it, you could put diffusers and sound absorbers to try and help. The upside is, with panel speakers in general, they only produce sound front and back. They do a very limited vertical and very, very little to the side of the speakers. So if your speakers have to be very close to the sidewalls, if let's say you don't have a choice, you can still make it work, whereas a cone speaker tends to splash the sound pretty much everywhere. So you could make it work, but yeah, obviously not ideal. If you have a longer room, it might work better. Yeah. What else?
I can probably think of a million things, but right
3
now...
minutes.
Wow.
So for me,
Okay.
the pros are they're very airy and open, the good ones. Very airy, very open, very transparent. The Martin Logans, the Magnepans. You get a nice big soundstage. You put the speakers wide apart. They can be easier to place than the cone speakers I mentioned because they don't disperse everywhere. Wonderful transients and can be really holographic. Cons can be tough to drive, like Philip said. Bass punchiness, it's very different than a cone because the bass impact is from the whole panel rather than, say, from a spot. So it doesn't quite hit you in the gut as like...
Well, as big as it is, it
Yeah.
actually does not move very much
Yeah.
air.
Yeah.
So that is a limitation.
And then the sweet spot can be quite narrow. No deep bass unless the panels are really large, and ultimately can't play very loud. So those are the cons. We might do a part 2 to this because there's so much to talk about. I'm
There's
having
a
great
lot
time.
to talk about with panels. I mean, I still really love them, but let's think about it. I bought panels, and I bought corns, I bought ribbons, I bought really good dynamic speakers. So that's 1 out of 4. You can't keep everything. Panels sort of, when you measured, like when you figured out exactly what you love about them and what you didn't get from them, other speakers did that better.
Yeah.
So I ended up going with other speakers, and in my journey, I transitioned from panels to dynamic speakers. Essentially, that's what I own now. It's dynamic speakers. I don't own any more ribbons. I don't have any more horns, and most of that is because, well, my space limitations became more constraining. So having smaller spaces, you know. You
And
end
one
up
of these
with
days we
dynamic
should cover
speakers.
some of these brands that people can buy used so they can look for it. Okay, we're being waved. Thanks for watching. Adrian at Audio Excellence, Philip. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notification. It helps the video. Thanks. We'll see you again. Bye-bye.